forgotten voyage that altered history. Fog pressed against the hull, as if the ocean itself were trying to keep the ship from being seen. Somewhere beyond the mist, waves rolled in slow, heavy pulses, and every creak of timber sounded like a warning. No one on board knew exactly where they were anymore, only that the maps no longer matched the horizon, and the compass needle refused to settle. This was not how the voyage was supposed to look. Weeks earlier, this ship had departed with confidence. Paperwork signed, cargo accounted for, and a destination that seemed certain. Now it drifted in a quiet that felt unnatural, as though the sea were holding its breath. Something had already gone wrong, badly enough that the crew had begun to avoid each other's eyes. Whispers moved through the decks, half-formed and quickly silenced, about decisions that should never been made. What makes this moment unsettling is not just the danger of being lost, but the feeling that history itself is about to be bent. There are voyages remembered for their glory, and others for their tragedy. This one was erased. You were never meant to hear about it. Yet the consequences of what happened remain, long before the ship ever slipped into that fog. Forces far larger than its crew were already steering it toward disaster. The world it sailed in was one obsessed with expansion, extraction, and speed, a time when nations measured their strength not by the well-being of people, but by how much wealth they could move across oceans. Empires were locked in a quiet race to control trade routes, resources, and new markets, and every voyage was a gamble placed on a global table. Ships were no longer just vessels. They were investments, floating ledgers where human decisions were translated into profit and loss. Owners demanded faster crossings, heavier loads, and fewer delays, even when those demands strained the limits of what wood and sail could endure. Technology had made long-distance travel possible, but it had also created a dangerous illusion of control, convincing powerful men that risk could be calculated and catastrophe managed. In reality, the margin for error was razor-thin. One storm, one navigational mistake, or one desperate choice could tip everything into ruin. Yet the system rewarded those who pushed hardest, not those who acted with care. Captains were pressured to take shortcuts. Crews were understaffed to save money, and safety became just another expense to be minimized. From a distance, it looked like progress, an interconnected world growing more efficient by the year. Up close, it was something far more fragile, a machine built to extract as much value as possible before breaking. This voyage was born inside that machine, shaped by its incentives and blind spots, long before the first wave ever struck its hull and everyone aboard. Back on the ship, the problems no one wanted to notice were becoming impossible to ignore. A minor delay turned into a missed waypoint, then into a growing uncertainty about their position. The charts no longer lined up with the stars, and the sea around them looked unfamiliar, as if they had slipped into a part of the ocean that did not care who they were or where they meant to go. Supplies that were meant to last comfortably now had to be rationed, and every decision about food, water, and fuel carried a quiet weight. Leadership, already fragile, began to fracture under that pressure. Orders were given, then questioned, then quietly ignored as fear spread through the crew. Each man believed he was acting sensibly, making the safest choice with the information he had. Yet those choices kept pulling the ship further from stability. Small arguments broke out over maps and measurements, and no one could agree on what the instruments were really telling them. Communication became strained, not because words were missing, but because trust was. Every new course correction felt like another gamble placed in the dark. Meanwhile, the ship itself seemed to sense the tension, groaning and shuddering as it pushed through heavy seas. What made this moment so dangerous was not a single dramatic failure, but the slow stacking of ordinary mistakes. Nothing looked catastrophic on its own, yet together they formed a tightening spiral. The crew could feel it, that creeping certainty that something irreversible was approaching, even if no one dared to say out loud. By the time they realized how far they had drifted from their original path, turning back no longer felt like an option, and pressing forward was becoming just as frightening. The ocean waited, silent, vast, and unforgiving. By the time the ship's officers gathered in that cramped cabin, the crisis had already become something more than a navigational problem. They believed they were running out of the one thing that could not be replaced at sea, and fear had narrowed their thinking to a single brutal calculation. If everyone stayed aboard, many might die. If some were removed, the rest could survive. What turned that grim logic into something unforgivable was the way it was framed, not as a human dilemma, but as a ledger entry. Lives were weighed against numbers, and numbers always spoke louder. In hushed voices, they convinced themselves that choosing who would be lost was an act of responsibility rather than cruelty. It did not feel like murder to them. It felt like management. Orders were written, names reduced to tallies, and the machinery of the system they served clicked into place. People were brought up from below, not because they had done anything wrong, but because the equations demanded it. Some resisted. Some were too weak to fight, and all were treated as if their existence had become an inconvenience. The sea closed over them quickly, swallowing the evidence as efficiently as it swallowed their bodies. What makes this moment so disturbing is not only the violence, but the calm that surrounded it. The ship did not erupt into chaos. It continued on its course, sails trimmed, decks washed, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. In the minds of those in charge, they had done what the system expected of them, protecting an investment and preserving a voyage. That cold justification is what allows history to turn away, because it reveals how easily ordinary people could become agents of something monstrous when the rules reward obedience over conscience. And in that silence, a truth was sealed, that profit had replaced mercy, and the ocean became an accomplice to it for all of its witnesses. The voyage did not end when the ship finally reached land. It only changed form. Official records were filed, losses were calculated, and the story was quietly folded into the machinery of government and commerce. No one was truly held to account. Yet something shifted beneath the surface. Regulators began to rewrite rules. Insurers adjusted what they would cover, and lawmakers asked questions they had never wanted to ask before. The tragedy became a reference point, a cautionary tale spoken in careful tones, even as the people responsible faded into obscurity. That is how systems protect themselves, by absorbing outrage until it becomes policy rather than justice. What matters now is not just what happened on that forgotten voyage, but what it revealed about how easily human lives can be reduced in numbers when power and profit align. The same logic still exists in different forms, whenever institutions value efficiency over dignity. Remembering this story is an act of resistance against that forgetting. It reminds us that progress without accountability is fragile, and that the past is never really gone, only waiting to be repeated if no one is willing to look directly at it again and refuse to look.